The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked toward her F-16 Fighting Falcon. Her confident stride and easy smile gave no hint of what was about to unfold. At 28, she was one of the youngest female pilots in the squadron, known for her precision flying and quick decision-making under pressure. The other pilots respected her, not because she was a woman in a male-dominated field, but because she could outfly most of them on any given day. Sarah had dreamed of flying since she was 7 years old, watching jets streak across the desert sky near her childhood home in Nevada. Her father, a retired Air Force mechanic, had encouraged her passion, building model planes with her in their garage and explaining the mechanics of flight. By the time she was 16, she had already earned her private pilot's license. The military academy followed, then flight school, where she graduated second in her class. This particular mission was routine reconnaissance over the mountainous border region. Intelligence reports suggested enemy activity in the area, but nothing that would require combat engagement. Sarah's aircraft was equipped with advanced surveillance equipment, and her job was to gather photographic evidence and relay coordinates back to base. She had flown similar missions dozens of times before. As she completed her pre-flight checklist, Sarah exchanged jokes with her crew chief, Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been maintaining aircraft longer than she had been alive. He was meticulous about his work, and Sarah trusted him completely. The aircraft had been thoroughly inspected. All systems were green, and weather conditions were perfect for flying. Everything pointed to another successful mission. The takeoff was smooth, and within minutes, Sarah was climbing to her assigned altitude of 25,000 feet. The landscape below transformed from the familiar grid of the airbase to rolling hills, and then to the rugged mountains that marked the border. Her radio crackled with routine communications from air traffic control, and she settled into the rhythm of the flight. What Sarah didn't know was that enemy forces had been tracking flight patterns from her base for weeks. They had identified the reconnaissance routes and had positioned new surface-to-air missile systems in carefully concealed locations throughout the mountain valleys. The intelligence reports that deemed the area safe were already outdated by the time she lifted off. As she approached the first waypoint on her route, Sarah noticed something unusual on her radar screen. Multiple contacts were appearing and disappearing, suggesting the presence of aircraft or missiles in the area. She immediately radioed back to base, requesting clarification on the radar signatures. The response was troubling. Ground control was not tracking any friendly aircraft in her vicinity. The first missile came without warning. Sarah's threat detection system screamed to life just seconds before impact. Years of training kicked in as she threw the aircraft into a violent evasive maneuver, pulling nearly 9 times the force of gravity. The missile missed by mere feet, but the close call sent adrenaline surging through her system. She was no longer on a routine reconnaissance mission. She was in a fight for her life. More missiles followed in rapid succession. Sarah pushed her aircraft to its limits, diving toward the deck and using the mountainous terrain to break radar locks. Her training had prepared her for this scenario, but the reality was far more intense than any simulation. The G-forces were crushing, and she could feel her vision beginning to tunnel as blood drained from her head during the extreme maneuvers. Despite her best efforts, the enemy had positioned their systems well. As Sarah pulled out of a steep dive, threading between 2 mountain peaks, a missile detonated close enough to send shrapnel tearing through her aircraft. The F-16 shuddered violently, and warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel. Hydraulic fluid began spraying across her canopy, and she could feel the aircraft becoming increasingly difficult to control. Sarah's training took over as she assessed the damage. Primary flight controls were compromised. Backup systems were failing, and fuel was leaking from punctured tanks. She was still airborne, but barely. The nearest friendly airfield was over 100 miles away, and she wasn't certain the aircraft would hold together that long. More concerning was the fact that she could feel warm liquid running down her left arm. Some of the shrapnel had found its mark. As she struggled to maintain control of the damaged aircraft, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Rather than attempting an immediate ejection over hostile territory, where capture was almost certain, she would try to nurse the crippled F-16 back toward friendly lines. It was a calculated risk, but one that her training and instincts told her was worth taking. The flight back to base became a test of will as much as skill. Every few minutes brought a new system failure or emergency warning. Sarah's left arm was growing numb, making it increasingly difficult to manage the flight controls. Blood loss was becoming a factor, and she could feel her concentration beginning to waver. Still, she pressed on, determined to bring herself and her aircraft home. 20 miles from base, disaster struck again. The damaged hydraulic system finally gave out completely, and the aircraft went into an uncontrolled spin. Sarah fought desperately to regain control, but the F-16 was no longer responding to her inputs. With the ground rushing up to meet her and all other options exhausted, she reached for the ejection handle. The last thing she remembered was the explosive force of the ejection seat firing, launching her clear of the doomed aircraft just seconds before it impacted the ground in a massive fireball. The rescue helicopter found Sarah 3 hours after the crash, hanging unconscious in her parachute 15 feet above the ground, caught in the branches of a massive oak tree. Her ejection had saved her life, but the landing had been brutal. The emergency beacon in her survival vest had guided the search and rescue team directly to her location, but what they found was far from encouraging. Paramedic Lieutenant Jake Morrison was the first to reach her. With 15 years of experience in combat medicine, he had seen his share of ejection injuries, but Sarah's condition was among the worst he had encountered. Her left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly fractured in multiple places. Blood had soaked through her flight suit from numerous shrapnel wounds, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Most concerning was her complete lack of response to verbal commands or physical stimuli. The extraction process was delicate and dangerous. Morrison and his team had to carefully cut Sarah free from both her parachute harness and the tree branches that had caught her, all while maintaining spinal immobilization protocols. Every movement risked worsening potential internal injuries or spinal damage. It took nearly 40 minutes to safely lower her to the ground and prepare her for transport to the base medical facility. During the helicopter ride back to base, Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her blood pressure dropped dangerously low, indicating severe internal bleeding, and she went into cardiac arrest twice. Morrison and his team worked frantically to stabilize her, administering blood products and emergency medications while the pilot pushed the aircraft to its maximum speed. The 20-minute flight felt like hours as they fought to keep her alive. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base's chief flight surgeon, was waiting when the helicopter touched down. A former Navy trauma surgeon with extensive experience treating combat injuries, she had been following Sarah's case since the initial distress call. What she saw as the medical team wheeled Sarah into the emergency bay confirmed her worst fears. This was going to be a fight for the young pilot's life. The initial assessment revealed the full extent of Sarah's injuries. Her left femur was shattered in 3 places, requiring immediate surgical intervention. Multiple pieces of shrapnel had penetrated her abdomen, causing significant internal bleeding and damage to her spleen and liver. 2 ribs were broken, and 1 had punctured her left lung, causing it to collapse. Most seriously, preliminary scans suggested potential spinal cord damage at the L2 vertebra. Dr. Hayes assembled her best surgical team for what would become a 14-hour marathon operation. The first priority was stopping the internal bleeding and repairing the damaged organs. Sarah's spleen had to be removed entirely, and a significant portion of her liver required reconstruction. The collapsed lung was reinflated and stabilized, but the chest injuries would require ongoing monitoring for potential complications. The orthopedic work on her leg was complex and challenging. The shattered femur required multiple titanium plates and screws to reconstruct, and there was significant soft tissue damage that complicated the repair. Dr. Mark Thompson, the base's orthopedic specialist, worked meticulously to align the bone fragments and restore as much function as possible. However, he was deeply concerned about the extent of nerve damage in the leg. Throughout the surgery, the medical team's greatest concern remained the potential spinal injury. Detailed scans revealed compression of the spinal cord at the L2 level, with significant swelling and bruising of the surrounding tissue. Neurosurgeon Commander Lisa Park was called in from the Regional Medical Center to assess the damage and determine the best course of action. The spinal surgery was the most delicate part of the entire operation. Commander Park carefully decompressed the spinal cord and stabilized the damaged vertebra with titanium rods and fusion hardware. However, the extent of nerve damage was difficult to determine during surgery, and the long-term prognosis for Sarah's ability to walk remained uncertain. When Sarah finally emerged from surgery, she was in critical but stable condition, She remained unconscious and on life support, with machines monitoring every aspect of her vital functions. Her family was flown in from Nevada. Her parents, David and Margaret Mitchell, along with her younger brother Tom, who was serving in the Army. The sight of their once vibrant daughter connected to countless tubes and monitors was devastating. Dr. Hayes met with the family to explain Sarah's condition and the challenges ahead. While the immediate threat to her life had been addressed, there were still significant concerns about infection, potential complications from the extensive surgery, and the unknown extent of neurological damage. The next 72 hours would be critical in determining her overall prognosis. 3 days after the surgery, Sarah finally regained consciousness. Her first coherent words were to ask about her aircraft and whether anyone else had been hurt in the incident. When told that she had been flying alone and that the F-16 had been completely destroyed, she seemed relieved that no one else had been injured. However, as the effects of the pain medication wore off, she began to realize the extent of her own injuries. The moment that would define Sarah's future came when Dr. Hayes delivered the devastating news about her spinal injury. Tests had confirmed significant damage to the nerves controlling her legs, and while some function might eventually return, the likelihood of her ever walking normally again was extremely low. For a pilot whose entire identity was built around physical capability and pushing the limits of human performance, this news was more devastating than any physical pain. Even more crushing was Dr. Hayes' assessment of her flying career. The combination of spinal injury, extensive orthopedic hardware, and ongoing neurological issues made it virtually impossible for Sarah to ever meet the strict physical standards required for military aviation. Her dream of flying, the passion that had driven every major decision in her life, was effectively over at the age of 28. Sarah's initial reaction was denial and anger. She refused to accept the medical assessments and demanded second opinions from other specialists. She was convinced that with enough determination and rehabilitation, she could overcome the injuries and return to flying. The medical staff understood her reaction. They had seen similar responses from other patients facing career-ending injuries. However, they also knew that acceptance of her new reality would be essential for her long-term recovery and adaptation to life after aviation. The rehabilitation process began 3 weeks after Sarah's surgery, but her attitude made progress nearly impossible. Physical therapist Captain Maria Gonzalez had worked with hundreds of injured service members, but Sarah's case presented unique challenges. The young pilot was brilliant, determined, and completely unwilling to accept that her flying career was over. This combination made her both an ideal patient and an incredibly difficult one. Sarah approached physical therapy with the same intensity she had brought to flight training, but her goals were unrealistic. While other patients focused on learning to walk with assistance or managing daily activities from a wheelchair, Sarah insisted on exercises designed to restore the reflexes and physical conditioning required for high-performance flying. She refused to use adaptive equipment and pushed herself far beyond safe limits, often causing setbacks in her recovery. The breaking point came during her 6th week of rehabilitation. Sarah had been secretly attempting to walk without assistance during night hours when the therapy staff was minimal. Captain Gonzalez found her collapsed on the floor of the therapy room at 2 a.m, having fallen while trying to navigate an obstacle course designed for ambulatory patients. Sarah had aggravated her leg injury and was bleeding from several wounds where she had hit the equipment. Dr. Hayes was called in to assess the damage from Sarah's fall. While the physical injuries were minor, the incident highlighted a more serious problem. Sarah was not psychologically ready to begin the process of adapting to her new limitations. Hayes recommended immediate intervention from the base's mental health team, specifically targeting the grief and denial that were preventing Sarah from making meaningful progress. Major Robert Chen, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma and adjustment disorders, began working with Sarah the following week. Their first sessions were confrontational and difficult. Sarah viewed psychological counseling as another obstacle preventing her from returning to flying, and she was openly hostile to suggestions that she needed to adjust her expectations or consider alternative career paths. Chen recognized that Sarah's identity was so completely tied to flying that accepting her injuries meant accepting the death of everything she believed herself to be. He had seen similar responses in other pilots, but Sarah's case was complicated by the fact that she had been considered exceptionally talented, even among elite aviators. Her entire sense of self-worth was built around capabilities that no longer existed. The breakthrough came during their 8th session, when Chen asked Sarah to describe what flying meant to her beyond just the physical act of controlling an aircraft. As she talked about the freedom, the challenge, and the sense of purpose that aviation had provided, she began to recognize that some of those same elements might be achievable in other ways. It was the first time since her injury that she had considered the possibility of finding meaning in life without returning to the cockpit. Gradually, Sarah began to engage more constructively with her rehabilitation team. She worked with occupational therapists to develop strategies for managing daily activities with her limited mobility. She learned to use a wheelchair effectively and began exploring assistive technologies that could help her maintain independence. Most importantly, she started to consider what she might want to do with her life if flying was truly no longer an option. 6 months after her crash, Sarah was medically retired from active duty with full disability benefits. The ceremony was both an honor and a heartbreak. Her squadron mates recognized her courage and sacrifice, but she struggled with the finality of walking away from military aviation. Her parents were proud of her service but worried about her future. Sarah herself remained uncertain about what came next. The transition to civilian life was more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. Her small apartment near the base felt cramped and limiting after years of living in military housing. With easy access to the flight line, simple activities like grocery shopping became exhausting challenges that required careful planning and energy management. The independence she had taken for granted as a healthy young adult now required constant effort and adaptation. More challenging was the loss of community and purpose that had come with military service. As a pilot, Sarah had been part of a tight-knit group with shared experiences and common goals. In civilian life, she felt isolated and disconnected from people who couldn't understand what she was going through. Well-meaning friends and family members often said things that highlighted how much her life had changed, usually making her feel worse despite their good intentions. Sarah's financial situation was stable, thanks to her military pension and disability benefits, but she struggled with feelings of uselessness and dependency. She had always been fiercely independent and goal-oriented, and now she spent most days at home with little structure or direction. Depression began to set in as the reality of her new life became clear. The turning point came through an unexpected source. Sarah received a letter from Lieutenant Jenny Walsh, a young pilot in her former squadron who had been shot down over hostile territory 2 months earlier. Walsh had been captured and held for 3 weeks before being rescued, and she credited Sarah's example of courage under fire with helping her survive the ordeal. The letter included a request for Sarah to speak with other female aviators about dealing with the psychological challenges of combat flying. Initially, Sarah dismissed the request. She felt like a failure and couldn't imagine having anything valuable to offer active pilots. However, Major Chen encouraged her to consider the opportunity as a way of maintaining connection to the aviation community while exploring new ways to contribute. He pointed out that her experience, both as an exceptional pilot and as someone who had faced the worst-case scenario, gave her unique insights that could benefit others. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed to speak with a small group of female pilots at her former base. She was nervous and uncertain about what to say, but as she shared her story and answered questions about dealing with fear and adversity in combat situations, she realized that she did have valuable knowledge to share. The pilots were genuinely interested in her perspective, and several approached her afterward to continue the conversation. The positive response from her presentation surprised Sarah and sparked the first genuine interest she had felt in anything since her crash. For the first time in months, she had spent several hours focused on something other than her limitations and losses. The experience reminded her that while she might never fly again, her knowledge and experience as a pilot still had value. Word of Sarah's presentation spread quickly through military aviation circles, and requests for similar talks began arriving from bases across the country. What started as a single favor for a fellow pilot evolved into regular speaking engagements about resilience, leadership under pressure, and adapting to unexpected challenges. Sarah found herself traveling to Air Force academies, flight training schools, and active duty squadrons, sharing her experiences with pilots at every level of their careers. These speaking opportunities provided Sarah with a renewed sense of purpose, but they also highlighted how much she missed the technical aspects of aviation. During her visits to active bases, she was drawn to the maintenance hangars and training facilities, fascinated by new technologies and procedures that had been developed since her crash. She began to wonder if there might be ways to contribute to military aviation that didn't require her to actually fly. The opportunity came through Colonel Patricia Hayes, the flight surgeon who had saved Sarah's life. Hayes had been promoted to oversee aviation medicine research at the Air Force's premier medical center, and she was looking for someone with operational flying experience to help develop new pilot training protocols. The position would involve analyzing flight data, interviewing pilots about decision-making processes, and helping design scenarios that would better prepare aviators for the psychological challenges of combat. Sarah was intrigued by the research position but concerned about whether she could handle being so close to flying without being able to participate directly. Hayes assured her that the work would be intellectually challenging and practically important, while also providing flexibility for her physical limitations. After considerable thought and discussion with Major Chen, Sarah decided to accept the position and relocate to the research facility. The new job proved to be more engaging than Sarah had anticipated. She worked with a team of psychologists, flight surgeons, and training specialists to develop evidence-based approaches to pilot preparation. Her unique perspective as someone who had experienced the ultimate emergency situation made her contributions particularly valuable. She could identify gaps in training that others might miss and suggest realistic scenarios based on actual combat experience. One of Sarah's first major projects involved analyzing data from pilot ejection incidents to identify factors that influenced survival and recovery outcomes. The work was emotionally challenging, as it required her to relive aspects of her own crash while studying similar experiences of other pilots. However, the research revealed important patterns that could be used to improve ejection seat design, survival training, and post-incident medical care. As Sarah delved deeper into the research, she began to understand how her own experience fit into broader patterns of human performance under extreme stress. She learned about the physiological and psychological factors that determined how people responded to life-threatening situations, and she gained new appreciation for how her training had prepared her to make effective decisions even when facing seemingly impossible circumstances. The research work also provided Sarah with opportunities to interact with active duty pilots in a professional context. Rather than being seen as a former pilot who had been forced out by injury, she was now recognized as an expert whose knowledge could help improve aviation safety and training effectiveness. This shift in perception was important for Sarah's own sense of identity and worth. 2 years into her research position, Sarah was asked to lead a project studying pilot decision-making during equipment failures. The study would involve installing sophisticated monitoring equipment in training aircraft to record physiological responses during simulated emergencies. Sarah would design the scenarios, analyze the data, and develop recommendations for improving pilot training based on the findings. The project required Sarah to spend significant time at active flying bases, working directly with pilots and instructors to develop realistic emergency scenarios. Being around aircraft and active pilots was initially difficult, stirring up old feelings of loss and regret. However, as she became more involved in the technical aspects of the work, Sarah found that her relationship with aviation was evolving rather than simply ending. Sarah began to realize that her passion for flying had always been about more than just the physical act of controlling an aircraft. She had been drawn to aviation because of the intellectual challenge, the precision required, and the opportunity to push the boundaries of human capability. These same elements were present in her research work. Even though she was now contributing from the ground rather than from the cockpit, the monitoring equipment for Sarah's study required sophisticated computer programming and data analysis capabilities that she didn't possess. She enrolled in evening courses in computer science and statistical analysis, finding that she enjoyed the logical problem-solving aspects of programming. The technical skills she developed opened up new possibilities for research projects and professional advancement. During the pilot monitoring study, Sarah worked closely with Captain Mike Rodriguez, a test pilot who had volunteered to participate in the most challenging scenarios. Rodriguez was an experienced aviator with over 2,000 flight hours, but he was impressed by Sarah's ability to design training situations that revealed weaknesses in his decision-making processes. Their professional collaboration gradually developed into a personal friendship. Rodriguez had heard about Sarah's crash and medical retirement, but was more interested in her current work than her past experiences. He appreciated her analytical approach to aviation problems and her ability to identify subtle factors that influenced pilot performance. For Sarah, working with Rodriguez provided a connection to active flying that felt positive, rather than painful. The preliminary results from Sarah's study revealed significant gaps in how pilots were trained to handle multiple simultaneous system failures. The data showed that even experienced aviators could become overwhelmed when facing scenarios similar to what Sarah had encountered during her own emergency. The findings suggested that training protocols needed to be revised to better prepare pilots for the psychological challenges of compound emergencies. Sarah's research was gaining recognition within the aviation medicine community, and she was invited to present her findings at national conferences. Her presentations combined rigorous scientific analysis with compelling personal insights, making complex research accessible to both technical and general audiences. The positive reception of her work was gratifying and helped establish her reputation as a serious researcher, rather than just a former pilot sharing war stories. As Sarah's confidence in her new career grew, she began to consider longer-term goals and possibilities. She had proven that she could contribute meaningfully to aviation safety and training, but she wanted to expand her impact beyond military applications. She began exploring opportunities to work with civilian aviation organizations and commercial airlines, areas where her research insights might benefit an even broader community of pilots and passengers. 3 years after beginning her research career, Sarah received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The caller was Colonel James Harrison, commanding officer of the 412th Test Wing at Edwards Air Force Base, home to the most advanced experimental aircraft programs in the world. Harrison had been following Sarah's research work and had a proposition that seemed impossible. He wanted her to consider returning to flying, not as a traditional pilot, but as a test subject for revolutionary new aircraft control systems. The conversation left Sarah stunned and skeptical. Harrison explained that her research had caught the attention of engineers working on next-generation unmanned aerial systems that could be controlled by operators with limited physical mobility. The technology was being developed for pilots who might be injured during extended conflicts, but it had broader implications for aviation accessibility. Sarah's combination of exceptional flying skills and personal experience with disability made her an ideal candidate to test these systems. Sarah's initial reaction was to dismiss the possibility entirely. She had spent 4 years accepting that her flying career was over and building a new identity around research and analysis. The idea of returning to aviation, even in a limited capacity, felt like reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal. However, the technical details that Harrison shared were intriguing enough to warrant further investigation. The new control system, designated the Adaptive Flight Interface, or AFI, represented a fundamental departure from traditional aircraft controls. Instead of relying solely on manual inputs through stick and rudder, the system used advanced sensors to monitor pilot intent through eye movement, minimal hand gestures, and even neural activity patterns. The technology could compensate for physical limitations by interpreting pilot commands and executing them through automated systems. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the lead engineer on the AFI project, met with Sarah to explain the technical capabilities and limitations of the system. Reeves had been working on assistive technologies for disabled veterans for over a decade, and the AFI represented her most ambitious project. She believed that the technology could not only help injured pilots return to flying, but could also enhance the capabilities of uninjured aviators by reducing physical workload and mental fatigue. The demonstration flight would take place in a modified training aircraft equipped with the AFI system alongside traditional controls. If Sarah chose to participate, she would undergo extensive training on the new interface before attempting actual flight operations. The project team emphasized that this was experimental research, not an attempt to return her to active duty status, but the implications were clear. Successful testing could open new possibilities for her future. Sarah requested time to consider the opportunity and discuss it with her support network. Major Chen, her former psychologist, encouraged her to approach the decision rationally rather than emotionally. He pointed out that her identity had evolved significantly since her crash, and that participating in the test program could be seen as a natural extension of her research work, rather than an attempt to reclaim her former life. Captain Rodriguez, who had become a close friend and trusted advisor, was more cautious. He understood the appeal of the opportunity but worried about the psychological impact if the test flights didn't meet Sarah's expectations. He encouraged her to be honest about her motivations and to consider whether the AFI project represented genuine interest in advancing aviation technology or simply a way to fulfill old dreams. After 2 weeks of consideration, Sarah agreed to participate in the AFI testing program. However, she established clear conditions for her involvement. She would approach the project as a researcher first and pilot second, focusing on evaluating the technology's potential rather than pursuing personal flying goals. She would undergo psychological evaluation throughout the process to ensure that the experience remained positive and constructive. The training phase for the AFI system proved to be unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her original flight training. Instead of learning to coordinate physical movements with aircraft responses, she had to master subtle eye movements and gesture patterns that the system would interpret as flight commands. The learning curve was steep, and initial sessions were frustrating as the technology struggled to interpret her inputs accurately. Dr. Reeves and her team worked closely with Sarah to calibrate the AFI system to her specific movement patterns and capabilities. The technology was sophisticated but still developmental, requiring constant adjustments and refinements based on user feedback. Sarah's analytical background proved valuable in identifying system limitations and suggesting improvements to the interface design. The breakthrough came during Sarah's 3rd week of training, when the AFI system suddenly began responding smoothly to her commands. The transition was dramatic. One moment she was struggling with delayed and incorrect responses, and the next the aircraft seemed to be reading her mind. The sensation was unlike traditional flying but unmistakably authentic. She was controlling an aircraft in flight, something she had believed would never happen again. The first official test flight took place on a clear morning in November, exactly 4 years and 7 months after Sarah's crash. The aircraft was a modified T-6 Texan equipped with the AFI system and staffed with a safety pilot who could take control if necessary. Sarah's role was to evaluate the system's responsiveness and identify any limitations that might affect operational use. As the aircraft lifted off, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions that she hadn't anticipated. The physical sensations of flight, the acceleration, the changing perspective, the subtle vibrations of the aircraft, were exactly as she remembered. However, the method of control was entirely different, requiring mental processes that felt both familiar and foreign. She was flying, but in a way that was uniquely her own. The test flight lasted 45 minutes and included basic maneuvers, navigation exercises, and simulated emergency procedures. Sarah found that the AFI system responded well to routine operations, but struggled with rapid control inputs during emergency scenarios. She was able to provide detailed feedback about system performance and suggestions for improving responsiveness during high-stress situations. Landing was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the flight, requiring precise control inputs at a time when the aircraft was most vulnerable to errors. The AFI system handled the approach phase smoothly, but the final touchdown required assistance from the safety pilot when the automated systems couldn't interpret Sarah's commands quickly enough. Despite this limitation, the overall flight was considered a success by the research team. The post-flight debriefing revealed both the potential and the current limitations of the AFI technology. Sarah's feedback was crucial in identifying areas where the system needed improvement before it could be considered for operational use. More importantly, her successful completion of the test flight demonstrated that pilots with significant physical limitations could potentially return to flying with the right technological support. News of Sarah's successful test flight spread quickly through military aviation circles, generating both excitement and skepticism. Some viewed the AFI system as a revolutionary development that could transform aviation accessibility, while others questioned whether the technology was advanced enough to ensure safety in operational environments. Sarah found herself at the center of debates about the future of pilot training and the role of technology in aviation. The success of the initial AFI test flight attracted attention from the highest levels of military leadership and defense contractors. Within weeks of Sarah's flight, she found herself briefing generals, congressional representatives, and aerospace industry executives about the potential applications of the technology. The project that had begun as experimental research was rapidly evolving into a program with national security implications. The most significant development came when Sarah was asked to participate in a classified demonstration for senior military officials. The scenario involved defending a forward operating base using the AFI-equipped aircraft to coordinate with unmanned systems in response to a simulated attack. This would be the first test of whether the technology could be effective in combat-like conditions, rather than just routine flight operations. Sarah spent weeks preparing for the demonstration, working with tactical specialists to understand the mission requirements and practicing coordination procedures with unmanned aerial vehicles. The complexity of the operation was far greater than anything she had attempted during her original military service, requiring her to manage multiple aircraft systems while making rapid tactical decisions under pressure. The demonstration took place at a remote testing facility with realistic threat scenarios and electronic warfare conditions. Sarah's role was to coordinate defensive responses using a combination of the AFI-equipped aircraft and several unmanned systems. The mission profile was designed to simulate the type of multi-domain operations that were becoming increasingly common in modern warfare. As the exercise began, Sarah found herself managing a complex tactical situation from an aerial perspective that felt both familiar and revolutionary. The AFI system allowed her to control her aircraft with subtle inputs while simultaneously directing unmanned systems through advanced interface technologies. She was essentially functioning as an airborne battle manager, a role that had been theoretically possible but never practically implemented. The simulated attack unfolded rapidly, with multiple hostile aircraft and ground-based threats engaging the base simultaneously. Sarah coordinated defensive responses across multiple domains, directing unmanned interceptors against incoming missiles while using her own aircraft's sensors to identify and target ground-based threats. The AFI system performed flawlessly, allowing her to maintain precise control while managing information flows that would have overwhelmed traditional pilot workload capabilities. The demonstration's climax came when enemy forces launched a coordinated assault that threatened to overwhelm the base's defenses. Sarah made a split-second decision to engage directly with her AFI-equipped aircraft while continuing to coordinate the unmanned systems. The maneuver required precise flying at low altitude while simultaneously managing multiple tactical systems, exactly the type of complex operation that traditional controls would have made impossible. For someone with her physical limitations, the successful completion of the demonstration marked a turning point not just for the AFI technology but for Sarah's own future. The military officials who observed the exercise were convinced that the system represented a revolutionary advancement in aviation capabilities. More importantly, they recognized that Sarah's unique combination of skills and experience made her an ideal candidate to lead the development and implementation of these new technologies. Within months of the demonstration, Sarah was offered a position as Director of Adaptive Aviation Systems, a newly created role that would oversee the development of technologies designed to expand aviation accessibility while enhancing operational capabilities. The position would involve working with engineers, pilots, and military planners to integrate AFI and related systems into operational aircraft and training programs. The offer represented everything Sarah had hoped for but never dared to. Expect a return to meaningful involvement in military aviation, the opportunity to fly again in a limited capacity, and the chance to help other disabled pilots pursue their dreams. However, accepting the position would require her to relocate to Edwards Air Force Base and take on responsibilities that would affect the careers and safety of countless other aviators. Sarah's decision to accept the position was influenced by a letter she received from Lieutenant Jenny Walsh, the young pilot whose earlier correspondence had helped spark Sarah's transition into speaking and research. Walsh had been selected for the initial group of pilots to receive AFI training, and she credited Sarah's example with inspiring her to volunteer for the experimental program despite the risks and uncertainties involved. The new position required Sarah to balance multiple complex responsibilities. She continued to serve as a test pilot for AFI development, while also managing research programs, training curricula, and policy development for adaptive aviation technologies. Her unique perspective as both an injured pilot and a successful researcher made her contributions particularly valuable. But the workload was demanding and occasionally overwhelming. One of Sarah's most significant achievements was establishing the Adaptive Aviation Training Center, a facility specifically designed to help disabled pilots learn to use AFI and related technologies. The center provided not only technical training, but also psychological support for pilots adjusting to new ways of flying. Sarah drew on her own experience with rehabilitation and adaptation to create programs that addressed both the practical and emotional challenges of returning to aviation after injury. The center's first graduating class included 12 pilots with various disabilities, ranging from amputees to pilots with spinal injuries similar to Sarah's. The graduation ceremony was particularly meaningful for Sarah, as she watched pilots who had been told they would never fly again successfully complete complex flight operations using AFI technology. Their achievements validated both the technology she had helped develop and her own decision to pursue this challenging career path. 5 years after her first AFI test flight, Sarah found herself preparing for her most ambitious mission yet. Intelligence reports indicated that a forward operating base was under siege by enemy forces, and traditional rescue operations had failed. The mission would require someone to fly deep into hostile territory using an AFI-equipped aircraft to coordinate a complex extraction operation involving multiple unmanned systems and special operations forces. As Sarah prepared for the mission, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The crash that had ended her original flying career had also opened doors to possibilities she never could have imagined. She was about to undertake a mission that was more complex and dangerous than anything she had flown during her original military service, using technologies that she had helped develop and flying capabilities that she had proven were possible, despite what everyone had initially believed. The mission launched at dawn, with Sarah's AFI-equipped aircraft leading a formation of unmanned systems toward the besieged base. As the formation crossed into hostile airspace, Sarah felt the same mixture of fear and exhilaration that had defined her original flying career. The difference was that now she was not just a pilot executing orders, but a leader who had helped create the very technologies that made the mission possible. She had not just returned to flying, she had helped revolutionize what flying could be.